Adolf Hitler. He came to power in Germany in 1933, and within 6 years had launched the most destructive war in human history. Hitler's decision to invade Poland on the 1st of September 1939 triggered declarations of war from Britain and France and set in motion a conflict that would eventually consume nearly every nation on Earth. His ambitions were not hidden. He had written about them in Mein Kampf years before taking power, outlining a vision of German racial dominance, the destruction of the Jewish people, and the conquest of vast territories in the East. What made him uniquely dangerous was his ability to channel genuine economic grievances and national humiliation into a movement that gave millions of people someone to blame and something to believe in. By the time the world understood what he intended to do, he had already built a military machine powerful enough to make stopping him extraordinarily costly. The Second World War killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people. Napoleon Bonaparte. He rose from relative obscurity in Corsica to become Emperor of France, and in the process, dragged Europe through more than a decade of nearly continuous warfare. The Napoleonic Wars, which stretched from roughly 1803 to 1815, reshaped the map of Europe, toppled ancient monarchies, and spread the ideas of the French Revolution across the continent at the point of a bayonet. Napoleon was a military genius of a kind that appears perhaps once in several centuries. He understood battlefield dynamics intuitively, moved armies faster than his opponents thought possible, and won engagements that by any conventional calculation he should have lost. His fatal flaw was an inability to accept limits. The invasion of Russia in 1812, launched with over 500,000 men, ended with the near-total destruction of his Grande Armée in the Russian winter. He never fully recovered from it, and within 3 years he was finished. Kaiser Wilhelm II. Germany entered the First World War under his leadership in 1914, though the question of how much personal responsibility he bears remains genuinely debated by historians. What is clear is that he presided over a German military and political culture that was aggressive, expansionist, and convinced that war with the major European powers was not just possible, but probably inevitable. When the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand created a crisis in July 1914, Wilhelm supported Austria-Hungary's harsh ultimatum to Serbia and gave assurances of German backing that made the wider war far more likely. He was not the sole architect of the conflict, but he was central to it. The First World War killed somewhere between 17 and 20 million people and set the conditions for nearly everything catastrophic that followed in the 20th century. Genghis Khan. He united the scattered nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe in the early 13th century and then turned the force he had built outward in a campaign of conquest that became the largest land empire in history. The Mongol invasions swept across Central Asia, China, Persia, and into Eastern Europe with a combination of extraordinary military discipline, tactical innovation, and deliberate terror. Cities that surrendered were sometimes spared. Cities that resisted were often destroyed completely, their populations massacred as a warning to others. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 effectively ended the Islamic Golden Age. Estimates of the death toll from the Mongol conquests range wildly, but some historians place the total at tens of millions, including the demographic collapse of entire regions. Genghis Khan saw conquest not as a necessary evil, but as a natural right, the strong taking what the weak could not hold. Mao Zedong. He led the Communist Party of China to victory in the Civil War in 1949. But it is the conflicts he started or prolonged after taking power that define much of his legacy. China's intervention in the Korean War in late 1950 transformed what had been a manageable regional conflict into a much larger and bloodier one, sending hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops across the Yalu River to push back United Nations forces. Mao also waged brutal internal campaigns that blurred the line between political purge and war, including the suppression of Tibet and the violence of the Cultural Revolution. His willingness to absorb catastrophic casualties, both of enemies and of his own people, was rooted in a genuine belief that suffering on a massive scale was an acceptable price for ideological transformation. Tens of millions of Chinese people died under his rule through war, famine, and political violence. Joseph Stalin. He did not start the Second World War. But his decisions before and during it shaped its course in ways that are impossible to separate from the larger story. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, which he signed with Hitler, gave Nazi Germany the freedom to invade Poland without fear of a two-front war. Stalin also launched his own unprovoked war against Finland in late 1939, a conflict that embarrassed the Soviet military and revealed weaknesses that Hitler later factored into his decision to invade the USSR. When Germany did attack in 1941, Stalin's purges of his own officer corps in the late 1930s had left the Red Army dangerously hollowed out, contributing to catastrophic early losses. The wars Stalin initiated and the ones he made possible together cost a staggering number of lives. Saddam Hussein. He led Iraq into 3 major wars over the course of roughly 2 decades, a record that is nearly unmatched among modern leaders. The invasion of Iran in 1980 launched one of the longest conventional wars of the 20th century, lasting 8 years and killing somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. A decade later, he invaded Kuwait, triggering the Gulf War and a coalition military response that drove Iraqi forces out in a matter of weeks. His calculation in both cases followed a similar pattern. He identified what he believed was a moment of vulnerability in his target and moved quickly, confident that he could achieve his objectives before effective resistance could form. Both times, the calculation proved wrong. His final downfall came in 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq and toppled his government, leading to his capture, trial, and execution. Hideki Tojo. He served as Prime Minister of Japan when the attack on Pearl Harbor was launched on the 7th of December 1941, bringing the United States into the Second World War. Tojo was a career military officer who had risen through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army and was deeply committed to Japanese expansion across Asia and the Pacific. He presided over a war machine that had already been fighting in China for years before Pearl Harbor, and that committed widespread atrocities across the territories it occupied. The decision to attack the United States was not made by Tojo alone, but he was its most prominent civilian advocate and bears significant responsibility for the consequences. Japan's war ended with atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Tojo was tried for war crimes by an international tribunal after Japan's surrender and was executed in 1948. Muammar Gaddafi. He ruled Libya for over 4 decades and was involved either directly or through proxies in conflicts across Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Gaddafi funded and trained insurgent groups in countries including Chad, Uganda, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and the Philippines. His military intervention in Chad during the 1970s and 1980s drew Libya into a prolonged and costly desert war. He sponsored terrorist attacks, including the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie in 1988. What made Gaddafi's relationship with war unusual was its indirectness. He rarely committed Libyan forces to large conventional engagements, but instead used oil, money, and ideology to fuel conflicts elsewhere, seeing himself as a revolutionary force whose influence should extend far beyond his own borders. His own end came violently when a NATO-backed rebellion in 2011 overthrew his government. Slobodan Milosevic. He rose to power in Yugoslavia in the late 1980s by weaponizing Serbian nationalism at a moment when the federation was already fracturing under enormous economic and political pressure. The wars that followed his rise in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo through the 1990s were among the most brutal conflicts Europe had seen since the Second World War. The siege of Sarajevo lasted nearly 4 years. The massacre at Srebrenica in 1995, in which Bosnian Serb forces killed more than 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys, was ruled a genocide by international courts. Milosevic was eventually arrested and transferred to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague, where he died in his cell in 2006 before a verdict could be reached. The wars he helped ignite killed around 100,000 people and displaced millions more. Hirohito. He was Emperor of Japan during the country's imperial expansion across Asia and the Pacific, and his precise role in the decisions that led to war remains one of the more contested questions of 20th century history. The traditional view held for decades that Hirohito was largely a ceremonial figure manipulated by military hardliners. More recent scholarship suggests his involvement was considerably more active, that he approved key military operations, received regular briefings on battlefield conduct, including atrocities, and made decisions that shaped the direction of the war. Japan's campaigns in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific resulted in millions of deaths. After the war, General Douglas MacArthur made the decision not to prosecute Hirohito, calculating that keeping him in place would make the occupation of Japan more stable. He remained emperor until his death in 1989. Pol Pot. He led the Khmer Rouge to power in Cambodia in 1975 and immediately began one of the most radical and destructive social experiments in modern history. The war he waged was turned inward against his own people. Cities were emptied at gunpoint. Intellectuals, ethnic minorities, and anyone associated with the previous government were systematically killed. The killing fields filled with the bodies of ordinary Cambodians who had done nothing except exist in the wrong category in Pol Pot's vision of a purified agrarian society. Cambodia also fought a border war with Vietnam that eventually led to a Vietnamese invasion in 1978 and the collapse of the Khmer Rouge government. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million Cambodians died under Pol Pot's rule, representing roughly a quarter of the entire population. He died in 1998 under house arrest, never having faced formal trial. Benito Mussolini. He brought Italy into the Second World War on Germany's side in June 1940, a decision that proved catastrophic for the country. Before the wider conflict, Mussolini had already launched wars of his own, invading Ethiopia in 1935, in a campaign that used chemical weapons against poorly armed defenders and shocked much of the international community. He also intervened in the Spanish Civil War alongside Hitler, supporting Franco's nationalist forces. Mussolini imagined himself as the builder of a new Roman Empire, projecting Italian power across the Mediterranean and into Africa. The reality of Italian military performance in the Second World War fell far short of that ambition. Italian forces struggled in North Africa, Greece, and elsewhere, repeatedly requiring German assistance to avoid collapse. Mussolini was deposed by his own government in 1943, arrested, briefly rescued by German commandos, and eventually killed by Italian partisans in April 1945. Vladimir Putin. He ordered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, launching the largest conventional land war in Europe since the Second World War. Putin had already moved against Ukraine in 2014, annexing Crimea and backing separatist forces in the Donbass region, in what was described at the time as a hybrid war. The 2022 invasion was a different order of magnitude, a direct military assault on a sovereign country involving hundreds of thousands of troops, missile strikes on civilian infrastructure, and the displacement of millions of people. Putin's stated justifications ranged from denazification to NATO expansion concerns, but the underlying logic appeared to be a refusal to accept Ukraine's existence as a genuinely independent state with its own political direction. The war continued into subsequent years at enormous cost to both sides and fundamentally altered the security architecture of Europe. Meles Zenawi. He led Ethiopia for over 2 decades and was involved in multiple conflicts across the Horn of Africa that reshaped the region. The Eritrean-Ethiopian War of 1998 to 2000, fought over a disputed border, was one of the deadliest conventional conflicts of the late 20th century, killing perhaps 100,000 people in 2 years of fighting. Zenawi also sent Ethiopian forces into Somalia multiple times to combat Islamist groups and shore up fragile transitional governments. His military decisions were often framed in the language of regional stability and counterterrorism, but critics noted that they also served to project Ethiopian power in ways that aligned with his domestic political needs. He died in office in 2012, and the regional tensions he navigated or exacerbated continued to define the politics of the Horn of Africa long after his death. If this video was helpful, please give the video a like and share it with a friend. It's the best way to support the channel and helps us keep creating content like this. Don't forget to subscribe to stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.